In this video, I'm going to show you my favorite way to make crochet ribbing, as well as some tips and tricks that will help you while making it. I will also show you how to begin a project with crochet ribbing where you add stitches to the top, as well as how to end a project with crochet ribbing using a no-sew join as you go method. Let's get started. To begin the ribbing, I first need to determine how many stitches I want. I'm going to go with 4 stitches because that gives me about 1 inch, which is a great size for the brim of a hat. So I'm just going to make a slip knot here and place it on my hook. I'm going to chain my 4 stitches, or my 4 chains. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that gives me the total number of chains that I need for my stitches. And then I'm going to add 1 for a turning chain. Now I'm going to work single crochets across this row, beginning in the 2nd chain from the hook. So not counting this turning chain that we just did, I'm going to work right back into this one and make a single crochet. Once again, single crochet, so insert, yarn over, grab the yarn and pull it through, and then yarn over and pull through both of those loops. I have 2 chains left here. And 1 left. Okay, now if I count, I have 4 stitches, and then I'm going to flip my work over from right to left so that my working yarn stays in the back. And then I'm going to chain 1. This is the repeat row. This is the row that you will do until you get the number of rows that you need. So chain 1, and then I'm going to work single crochets across this row again. Instead of working underneath both loops as you normally would for single crochets, I'm going to work into the back loop. So if you flip your piece like this, you have these little V's that form the top of the stitches. I'm going to insert my hook from front to back underneath that back loop. So I'll show you that again. Insert just underneath that back loop, and then yarn over, pull through, and then yarn over and pull through 2 to finish that single crochet. So I have 3 stitches left here. You may see this written in a pattern as single crochet back loop only, or BLO. That's what it means to just work in the back loop only. Last one, once again working underneath that back loop, yarn over and pull through 2. And once again, I have 4 stitches here. I'm going to flip my work again from right to left and chain 1. Back loop only, single crochet. And then flip it over. You just continue to do this until you have the number of rows that are required for your project. One tip that I have when working your ribbing is after you've made a few rows to stop and make sure that you count your stitches. Now for this one I only have 4, so I can very easily kind of eyeball that and tell that I have 4 there without actually having to count. However, if you're starting with a longer amount, like let's say you have 10 or more, or if you're working in a lighter weight yarn, like let's say anything underneath a DK weight, you may want to stop and actually count your stitches because it's very easy after you've done a few rows, especially if you're working in lighter weight yarn. You could miss a stitch to work into right here at the end and chain up and turn. And there's nothing worse than getting to the end of your ribbing and discovering that it's kind of slanting or that you've missed a few stitches. Another tip that I have is how to count these rows. Unless you're sitting there and you're making tally marks after every single row, you're probably going to get a few rows in and then lose track of how many that you've made. So if you look at these rows, they have what I like to call peaks and valleys. You have these little valleys that dip down and these little mountain peaks that dip back up. So it's kind of almost like a little zigzag. If we flip it over and look here, I have row number 1 that has a ridge, that's our peak, and then row number 2 dips down into a valley. You can kind of see how they form those peaks and valleys. When I count, I like to flip it over to make sure that my row number 1 begins with a valley and my row number 2 ends with a peak. So you can see here, if I have it this way, it ends with a valley. I like to count this way because it's just easier to count these ridges. So I know that in between each of these ridges is 2 rows. So then I can just go up 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and now I have 1 more, so I know that that's 11. So let's say I need 12 altogether. I know that I need to turn and work another row. Another thing that I like to do, let's say you have a project that needs 80 rows to begin with, is to go after so many rows and add either a stitch marker or a paper clip or something to help you with the counting of the rows. That way you don't have to go through and count them each time. So I would go through and do 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and then take my stitch marker or paper clip and just simply insert it right there. So that way I know after each stitch marker I have 10 rows. So then I can just go up and count 10, 20, 30, etc. Now I'm going to show you how to add additional rows to the top of this ribbing. So let's say we go back to our hat pattern that requires us to make 80 rows of ribbing, and then it might say something like rotate the work and then work stitches along the tops of each of these rows. I'm going to work single crochets into the top of this row, but your pattern may call for something different. So if we go back and remember, we had the peaks and the valleys. If we turn over, we had counted up 2, 4, 6, 8. And then when we flip it over, we're going to end with a valley stitch. So if you have an even number of stitches in your row count, you're probably going to end with one of these valley stitches. So I'm going to chain 1, and we have valley, peak, etc. Now I'm going to work into the chains on the top of each of these where we did our chain 1 and then turned our work over. So I've chained 1, and underneath the valley, I'm going to call it the valley row, there are these 2 chains right here that I'm going to insert my hook into. So it's again looking at it from the side. I'm just going to insert underneath both of those chains. Gives it a nice secure place to work into. I'm going to work my single crochet. So I've done that row there. I'm going to have my peak row here. There's kind of like one loop that I like to work into on the top here. I'm just going to insert it right into that one loop and do my next single crochet and then continue to work across. So I have my valley stitch next, my valley row next. I'm going to work underneath both of those loops again, single crochet. Then I have my peak row here. I'm going to work into that top. So I'm only working underneath one loop underneath that peak row, but I'm working underneath 2 on the next one. So it gives it a little bit more security. And you may find different places that you prefer to work into. This is just what I like to do. As you get more used to this, you might find different ones that you work into. So here we have 2 left. So I have my valley and my peak. I'm going to work underneath both of those for my valley. And then I'm left with my peak stitch here. It's kind of off to the side a little bit. I'll work into that last one. That was our very first time that we chained, so that one might be a little bit tricky. Then if I go back through and count, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which is the amount that I need. So that is how you would work along the top. And then you would just turn your work over and continue to work your pattern. Let's say I'm working half double crochets for the rest of my pattern here. I would just work into the tops of those stitches like normal. So now when we get here to the end, you can see we continue going forth with the project, and we have this nice little row of ribbing at the bottom. Now I'm going to show you how to add crochet ribbing to the end of your project. So let's say you're doing a top-down sweater, or you're making a hem, or if you are making a sleeve cuff, instead of making that strip of ribbing and then sewing it on to the end, I'm going to show you how you can do it with a join as you go method. So I have 10 stitches here. This is going to represent the bottom of my sweater or the front of my cardigan if you're making like a button band for a cardigan. I'm going to start once again with 4 stitches. So I'm going to chain up 4. And then once again adding 1 for my turning chain. I'm going to skip this first chain just like before and work single crochets until I get back down to the bottom. So I like to call this part that I had up here the top of the turning chain, and then working back down to the bottom. And number 4. So if I look, I have 4 single crochets there, and now I need to anchor these onto my stitches from the row that I ended with. If I have an even number of stitches, I'm going to do something a little bit different than if I have an odd number of stitches. So if you have an odd number of stitches, so let's say I have 11 here instead of 10, instead of working back down into this stitch that I came out of, I would work into the next one and do a slip stitch, and then do another slip stitch. And the reason why is when I get to the end, I want to have 2 stitches left. So if I have an odd number to start off with, I'm going to work in the next 2. But since I have an even number of stitches, I'll show you what to do here. So this is the chain that we came out of, the stitch that we came out of right here. I'm actually going to work right back down into that same stitch. So I'm going to go right back down into that one and slip stitch, and then work into the next one and slip stitch. So you're always going to do 2 slip stitches when you get to the bottom. So this is going to be my setup row number 1. Now from the side, it looks like I have 6 stitches all together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I'm going to turn my work, once again leaving my working yarn in the back. I'm going to skip those next 2 slip stitches. Not going to chain, I'm just going to completely ignore them. Ignore that one and ignore that one. And once again, working in the back loops, I'm going to start in that next one and single crochet. Should have 4 all together here. and my last one. I have 4 single crochets. I'm going to flip it over again, and this time I'm going to chain 1. And this is where we're going to repeat. So this is going to be row 1 of our repeat here. Just gonna chain 1 at the top, and then I'm going to work in the back loops. And once again, this is where counting will come in handy. And I'll show you why when we get down to the bottom here. I've just done 3. And you can see that this stitch kind of likes to hide a little bit. Where we've turned our work, you might have to pull this guy down a little bit. So this is very easy to miscount your stitches along here if you're not counting after every few rows, making sure that you have the right amount. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So I worked my 4 single crochets. Now I'm not going to work into the stitch that I just came out of like I did in the beginning. I'm going to work in the next 2 stitches. So slip stitch, and slip stitch. Once again, turn my work. I'm going to skip those 2 slip stitches and then start in the next one. Back loop only, single crochet until I get to the top. There's 3 and 4. Make sure I'm working in the right loop there. Once again, turn my work so my working yarn is in the back, chain 1, working back down in the back loops, 1, once again, this guy's trying to hide, so you might have to pull it apart a little bit and get your hook in there to make sure that you get that last stitch. It's very easy to lose that last one, especially if you have a longer row count. Not working into this one, you can kind of pull up and see the last one that you've worked into, which is right here. I'm going to work in the next 2. Slip stitch, turn, skip those 2, no chaining, just turn and skip. This very last one can get kind of tricky to work into also, which is why it's kind of helpful to count, because that turning chain can kind of cover it up a little bit. Let's again turn again, chain 1 because we're at the end of our row, going back down again. Working down in that very last one there. It's always well hidden. And then slip stitch into the next 2. So this one here and this one here. So now I have 2 stitches left, which is where I want to be. I'm going to skip these 2 chains. So skip 1, skip 2, work into the back loop of the next one, single crochet, this little guy is trying to hide again. Okay, now we come to the end, and like I said, I like to have 2 at the end of my row so I can just work those last 2 slip stitches right into there. So I'm going to chain 1, single crochet till I get down to the base. Find the hidden one. Oops, slipped right off. So now I have my last 2 stitches to work into. And this very last one. So now I can turn, skip the next 2, 1, 2, and my last one here. So now I have my ribbing at the end. So let's say this is a sweater or a piece where the ribbing is at the bottom. I have my top part here, and then my nice neat row of ribbing at the bottom. Thank you for watching this video on ribbing. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, as well as subscribe to my channel for more crochet tutorials.